It was June 16, 1943, and a lone B-17 bomber had taken flight out of Port Moresby en route on a photo recon mission of coral reefs and Japanese emplacements at Bougainville and the Buka Passage, also Rabaul. As they started to pass over their intended target, and at that moment, the belly gunner, Forrest Dillman, spotted Zeros on the tarmac and pilots running to them. They had been spotted. They were Captain Jay Zemer and his eager beavers of the 43rd Bomb Group. They had been labeled misfits and troublemakers, but they always took the recon missions no one else would take. And they also had to find their own plane to refurbish. They found an old E-model B-17 with a history of bad luck, call sign Old 666, which was derived from its tail number 41-2666. They fitted this B-17 with more armament, adding many guns than just the original 13 guns. They added a nose gun controlled by Zemer, the pilot. The Bombardier's nose guns were changed from 30 caliber to 50 caliber machine guns, and they also added guns at the waist area and the radio man's positions, giving Old 666 19 50 caliber machine guns, making it the most armed aircraft in the Pacific theater. It was bristling like a porcupine. Zemer and his crew knew the Zeros from Buka would be on them in no time. But 37,000 Marines and GIs were preparing for a Bougainville invasion, so scrapping the mission wasn't even a possibility. These photos of hidden reefs were important and vital to the landings at Bougainville. Suddenly, Herbert Pugh at tail gunner, seeing over a dozen Zeros lift off, coming toward them, yelled to Zemer and Brighton, the co-pilot. The first wave of Zeros and twin-engine fighters were circling them like vultures, then pounced. There are many times when bombers had to dogfight a dogfighter, and Old 666 was shuddering as the crew opened up their guns, laying down a barrage of bullets towards the Japanese fighters, downing a few when all of a sudden 20mm cannon punched through Old 666's nose, exploding, knocking Second Lieutenant Joe Sarnowski, the Bombardier nose gunner, 15 feet back off his guns, and injured Navigator First Lieutenant Ruby Johnston. Sarnowski had lacerations and a bowling ball sized hole in his side, but he amazingly crawled back to his nose gun and started laying down fire again, leaving a massive trail of blood. He gripped his gun and ended up downing a twin-engine fighter and setting it ablaze. He kept firing his guns until he collapsed. Zemer then splashed a Zero with his nose gun, and that was when Zemer took stock of the cockpit damage from the 20mm cannon. Co-pilot Lieutenant J.T. Brighton was slumped on his controls. The instrument panels were blown away. The cables were cut that controlled the rudders and horizontal stabilizers, and the left cockpit window was blown completely away with metal peeled back. Zemer was being hit with blasts of wind and noise from the right Cyclone engines. The lower bulkhead had a gaping hole also. The route between the cockpit to the front nose compartment. Zemer had also suffered major wounds, especially his lower torso of his body. His arms and legs were cut badly and just torn with shrapnel. Even his comms were damaged to the point of being useless. The co-pilot Brighton awoke with only a head wound. He went to check on the crew. When he returned, he informed Zemer that George Kendrick had stowed the cameras and film and was manning the waist guns, and that the oxygen tanks had been damaged beyond repair. They had to descend below 10,000 feet or they would pass out from hypoxia. They dropped to 6,000 feet, and all of a sudden the assistant flight engineer, Sergeant Johnny Abel, and George Kendrick yelled out more bogies. Abel was able to knock out a Zero, then slumped to the floor with both legs massively injured. The Zeros kept circling old 666, making head-on passes at the B-17. Zimmer then realized how bad he was injured and bleeding, and while J.T. Brighton tended to the rest of the crew, he was constantly returning to the cockpit trying to get Zimmer to relinquish control of old 666 so he could be patched up. After 45 minutes of pure, unadulterated hell, the Zeros were now low on ammo and fuel and decided to peel away. But old 666 still had 500 miles to go before the mission was over. A tall order for such a wounded bird. Even with no instruments, Zimmer knew they were losing altitude, but they were determined to get these photos back to base. Zimmer decided that the only option was landing at a 7,000-foot grass airstrip in the jungle at Dobodura, 90 miles east of Port Moresby. But he had no real heading with his destroyed instruments. All at that moment, Sergeant William Willie Vaughn, the radio man, reported that he had an experimental Navy issue radio that was still working. It could still transmit Morse code. After some minutes, an American patrol vessel and Australian coast watchers picked up Vaughn's transmission, was able to triangulate old 666's position and relayed it to Vaughn, who then could plot a course to Dobodura. Pugh, meanwhile, crawled up towards the nose guns to find Sarnowski collapsed on his guns, his ammo belts empty and one barrel burned out. Pugh lifted Sarnowski and realized he was still alive. Pugh pulled the rosary Sarnowski kept in his pocket and handed it to Sarnowski, who then pressed it to his lips, kissed it, then drew his last breath, dying on his guns, a true American hero. Zimmer's condition was deteriorating badly, and Brighton took over the controls. They finally reached the airfield, and with no wing gauge or brakes, they bounced 3 times and was approaching the end of the runway when Brighton cut the wheel and the left wing dug into the rocks, sand, and dirt, and the B-17 skidded in a circle, finally stopping. It was 12:15 p.m. It had been over 8 hours since takeoff. Zimmer had finally passed out. They then came to hearing someone say, "Get the pilot last, he's dead." He wanted to shout but could not. And he finally realized, or they finally realized, he was not dead. He had lost nearly half of his blood and had to have 150 pieces of shrapnel removed from his arms, legs, and torso. Old 666 had endured one of the longest sustained attacks in aviation history, and the photos that were taken were vital to the landings at Bougainville for the GIs and the Marines. Both Jay Zimmer and Joe Sarnowski were awarded the Congressional Medals of Honor. The other crewmen, J.T. Brighton, Willie Baum, Herbert Pugh, Forrest Dillman, Johnny Abel, Ruby Johnston, and George Kendrick all received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest medal for bravery and heroism. Thus, old 666 and its crew became and still remains the most highly decorated combat air crew in American military history. A hell of a job for a bunch of misfits, in my opinion. I salute these brave men, these eager beavers, and their final flight of old 666.
Well, there you go, guys. We hope you enjoyed this new little segment that we're gonna kind of pursue. Be sure to do the YouTube things, you know, like, sub, noti bell, all that jazz, and yeah, definitely helps us out. So until next time.